Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thanks for joining us. My name's Andrew Patterson. I'm the CEO of Family Daycare Australia. I just wanted to jump on briefly this evening. Firstly, to welcome our panellists, Stephanie, Donna and Rachel. Thank you for joining us tonight. And to thank you all for investing your time to be here with us tonight. Before we get underway, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which we're all coming to us tonight. And to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. To get us underway this evening, I'd like to hand over to, welcome and introduce our host for this evening, our Advocacy Engagement Manager, Michael Farrell. Michael, welcome.
Thanks, Andrew. I'll probably just, as usual, just hand it straight back. And just before we dive into tonight's discussion and introduce our amazing guests.
I'm not sure if is Michael on mute? Sorry.
Oh, can you not hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay.
I can hear you.
Andrew? Oh, it appears Andrew can't hear me, but I'm just going to see if we can overcome our little tech difficulties. Usually I hand it back to, can you hear me, Andrew?
Yeah, I can hear you now. I'm sorry.
Okay, don't worry. I was just saying, as usual, before we sort of dive into tonight's discussion and introduce our guests, do you mind if I throw back to you and if you give us a little bit of insight into some of your thoughts on tonight's topic of fostering relationships and why that's so important in the family daycare context?
Yeah, sure. And sorry if that was just me or you. I'm not too sure. I could hear myself talking, but I couldn't hear anybody else. So, yeah, sure. Thanks, Michael. Look, I think tonight's a great subject for us. I think it's one that really gives us an opportunity to celebrate our strengths as a sector. We know it's widely recognised across governments, across academic research, and particularly across users of family daycare, just the strengths of the relationships in the family daycare context. We know that as a sector, we perform really well under the National Quality Framework in the areas around relationships. And Michael, you probably talk more to that later on in the session, but I think that's worth noting. And when we look at and we sort of reflect on why it is that way, I think we can sort of acknowledge some of the inherent strengths of our sector in terms of relationships, and we know that continuity of care is a really strong foundation of building good relationships with children, particularly, and families. The small group setting in family daycare obviously is a contributor to strong relationships in the family daycare context, and I guess when we contrast that to our long daycare counterparts and some of the challenges they face in this area, we look at things like, rotating shifts or, casual workforce and the issues and the challenges that creates, but where with educators connecting in a meaningful way with parents and children. So I think we're really well placed and to perform really strongly in building relationships with families and children, and we know all the evidence tells us that they're really strong contributors to quality outcomes for children. So I think that's really important for us to note and to really celebrate. And I think when I look across the subject matter for tonight, that third topic is a really interesting one around those intersector relationships. We know that, again, the evidence tells us where family daycare services or family daycare as a sector is performing really well. We have really strong relationships between educators and services, and they work well and in a supportive and sort of mutual relationship. I think that's a really core underpinning and one for us to unpack further. We know that I think for the most part, educators are great and services really, really good at connecting with their communities and building relationships with their communities, and are really present in the community as well. And I think the last one, educator to educator relationships, is a good topic of discussion for the panel, because it is essentially the professional and support network for educators, and sometimes it's done well, sometimes I think there's opportunities for us to all do better in that space, because educators work in isolation. They don't have a lot of time for professional development. So I think that those intersector relationships are an important area for us to explore further.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think that you've probably touched on some of the really key aspects of what we'll probably get into in more detail tonight. Things like the inherent strengths of the model, continuity of care and those ongoing relationships and how important that is, and what we know about that in terms of the impact on children, in particular cohorts of children, and the sort of nuances of the various different types of relationships and how that intersects with some of the strengths of the model, in relation to things like, you said, connection to community and, some of the challenges as well, I guess, that come with the model, in particular for educators working in isolation. And, there's always, I think, it comes up in a number of the different discussions in family daycare that there's things that are inherent to the structure of the model itself that provide for strengths, and they also come with the sort of flip side to that, which are some challenges. So thanks for introducing the topic tonight. So tonight, as we've said, it's all about fostering relationships, and we've got three amazing guests with us on the panel who will be sharing their thoughts and expertise. Our first guest is a family daycare educator with the West Country Family Daycare Service in South Australia and was named the Excellence in Family Daycare Educator of the Year in 2023. So welcome, Stephanie Hoy. Do you mind just giving us a little bit of your background in relation to the sector and just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me on this panel. It's awesome. I've been working in family daycare for 8 years now. I live and work in Port Lincoln. It's a small rural coastal town in South Australia. I work Monday to Thursday, and across a working week, I have 10 children in care from 9 families.
And so you've been in the sector 8 years. Were you in other parts of the sector before that, Stephanie? Or
no. When I first left school and I went through uni, I put myself through uni, nannying and governessing and doing those kinds of things. So I've worked with children before, but in capacity, I had to retrain after doing other roles. So yeah, when we moved down here, I retrained and started family daycare.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us. Our second guest is currently working as an early childhood team leader with Kentish Lifelong Learning and Care in the Northern Territory. Rachael Sheppard, thanks for joining us.
Oh, good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me as a part of this panel tonight. I'm thrilled to be here. So I'm the early childhood team leader for Kentish Lifelong Learning and Care. We're a not-for-profit organisation that operates throughout the Northern Territory. We've got educators based in Alice Springs, Darwin and Palmerston. So Palmerston is a outer suburb of Darwin. 2 very different locations that our educators operate from. So one being urban and the other being remote. My role is quite diverse with the company. I oversee all of our early learning programs. So we've got long daycare centres and we've just taken on an OSH. My background has been in childcare. So I've been in the sector for 17 years. It's a passion of mine. It's something that I've always wanted to do. And I've also been a family daycare educator myself. So I know the challenges that the educators face. And, I'm there to support them. I've got a really supportive team. We've got a team coordinator in Darwin and Alice Springs and we work really closely together to achieve great outcomes for the children and families in our care.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us, Rachel. I think it's going to be tonight's going to be interesting because of, we'll be able to get into some of the sort of nuances of those different, how relationships and how the structure might differ in those different locations as well. So it's great to have, that sort of diversity on the panel. And our final guest joining us from Victoria is a team leader with Uniting Family Daycare Wimmera and was a coordinator of the Year National Finalist in 2023. Please welcome everyone, Donna Klitscher. Donna, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's going to be a wonderful night. I'm based in the Wimmera. I live in Horsham and I oversee the family daycare program right across the Wimmera. We currently have 12 educators, but always trying to recruit more. I've been in the early years sector since 2004. So I've worked in childcare centres, kindergarten inclusion. I've been a nanny, but the last 5 years I've been family daycare team leader at Uniting. I was first introduced to family daycare when I was 16 because my mother was an educator for many years. So I've seen a lot of changes.
Wow, you've got a really long-standing background in the sector that goes beyond your professional life into your personal life. That's fantastic. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. I think it's a really important topic, and it's, there's some, like we said at the start, there's some nuances in relation to family daycare that I think should be, we should sort of shine a light on and explore in some more depth. And I know these conversations sort of happen definitely across services, but I think that those really unique relationship dynamics in a family daycare context that don't necessarily apply in other ECEC contexts in exactly the same way due to that structure, because things like, the overwhelming majority of educators being independent contractors, operating remotely in their own residences or in a venue, largely not in daily direct contact with colleagues or peers, and that really have that close and very personal, ongoing direct contact with families. It was a number of years ago, we partnered with the Social Policy Research Centre in New South Wales, the University of New South Wales, to conduct a research project that one of the key findings of which was that relationships are really central to supporting quality in family daycare. Strong relationships across the service between educators and children, educators and families, educators and other educators, coordination unit staff and educators, and of course those within the coordination unit itself underpin the quality of practice in family daycare services in so many different ways. Relationships not only important to the daily interactions between educators and children, obviously, they're really at the core of systems and processes that are inherent in a high-functioning, high-quality family daycare service. So I think it's also probably important to acknowledge that, as we're all aware, 3 of the quality areas in the NQS are centred around relationships. Obviously, those being quality area 4, staffing arrangements, quality area 5, relationships with children, and quality area 6, collaborative partnerships with families and communities. I think it's when you look at the data, it's probably quite unsurprising that these are the quality areas which family daycare performs best in. And just looking at the stats from January from a CEQA, we can see that 95% of services are rated meeting or exceeding in quality area 4, 96% in quality area 5, so relationships with children, and 94% in quality area 6, which are comparable to the proportions of the national figures, the national proportions across all service types. So fittingly, the first topic that we're going to discuss tonight is growing and nurturing relationships with children. So centering on quality area 5, in essence, which is really crucial area for family daycare educators and service staff in terms of obviously assisting in fostering the best possible learning and developmental outcomes for children. When we look at the guide to the NQF, it states quality area 5 of the National Quality Framework focuses on educators developing responsive, warm, trusting and respectful relationships with children and young people that promote their well-being, self-esteem, sense of security and belonging. So obviously a key area is really what, apart from the structural frameworks that surround what we do within the sector and what we need in those frameworks to keep children safe, it really is this key area around relationships with children where we can focus on what it is we need to do to get those best possible outcomes. So Stephanie, did you want to lead us off by discussing how you build relationships with the children that you care for, and any advice that you might give educators in considering this particular topic?
Sure. I think when I thought about this, I kind of stepped back a step prior to developing the relationships. I think the interview process and getting the right families and the right groups of people on each day is really important. So it's really hard to stretch yourself as one person if you've got 3 1.5-year-olds and a 4-year-old. So just making sure your daily mix and your weekly mix is made up really nicely so that you've got enough time to be able to create meaningful relationships with each child across the week. So once you've got your interview process down pat and you're actually getting a good balance of the children across a day and across a week, I make sure that any newcomers when they start, we have the parents come in once or twice before the children actually start. If parents are concerned, I offer options for them to come for a half day a couple of times just to ease their way in, or come and visit with us on another day, or even at the playground or something, just so the child can get familiar with the environment and the people. And that also tends to put the parents at ease as well, I think, which is really important. So building a bond with a child is also making sure that the parents are really happy as well. So an anxious mother will leave an anxious child at your door. So if you can, whatever you need to do to make sure that the parents are okay and feel comfortable is totally worth doing. You'll be able to get a secure attachment with that child much quicker. When I do have new families start or new children start, I like to make sure I'm very organised and I'm able to spend time with them. So I usually, when I have new children start, they're usually younger. So they'll be in their first 6 to 12 months. So I will be on the floor for as long as they need me. So that could be in the first couple of weeks. It's just, let them be with you, get used to you, read them books. And you'll know when they're ready because they'll move a little bit further away and then they'll come back and they'll do their circle of security. And you're good once they can eat, once they're eating and they go down to sleep really well and there's no dramas. You've nailed that and you're ready to move on. Life will be really easy from there. Yeah, so that would be make sure you spend time and really make sure that connection is really right.
Yes, spending time is good. It's a good way of thinking about. I mean, what you're talking about is really sort of having that foundational relationship of trust with parents first and putting effort into building on that. And allowing for options for them to come in first, and also when the children first start attending, that's really pivotal in securing that secure relationship with children, new children. And I think it's interesting that there's referring to those clear signals of like comfort levels of things like eating as being a clear signal that the children are sort of settling in well to the service. So, Rachael, did you want to share your thoughts on any from your perspective around what strategies educators can use to build relationships with children? Perhaps for those that might be facing issues of things like settling into a service or even potentially displaying some challenging behaviours?
Yeah, so I've actually spoken to my educators around this question, and I've asked for their feedback in what they do in their services. So they shared with me that one of them said she's very big on promoting engagement, like a bit like what Stephanie said, having the same age groups on certain days, and then being involved in play and supporting that child, feel comfortable in the environment, and then being able to provide that positive feedback to the parents, and talking about, the child's stay in front of them so they feel good about themselves, even if it's something small to share. That way, the child starts to feel a sense of belonging within that environment. We also make sure that the orientation period is enough for maybe children that struggle with attachment. And then we support our educators with the attachment theory. So we delve into the John Bowlby attachment theory and also the circle of security. So seeing the educator as the safe hands for that child. One of the brilliant things about family daycare is the smaller ratios as well. So having worked in a long daycare setting and family daycare, children tend to settle much quicker in the family daycare environment. And I think it's because it's not so overwhelming. It's not usually a noisy space, which, allows the child time to work out their environment and their surroundings. But we like to also support the educator as the coordination unit. We have a very good relationship with Early Childhood Australia NT, who holds the inclusion contract. So our inclusion professionals also get involved in this process. They might come along for a home visit with us, and if there's something that we've missed, they can also support the educator and provide strategies that can be used to support that child. It's very rare for a family not to settle in any of our family daycare environments. And I think it's because of the relationship from the very beginning. Families are invited into a family home, they conduct an interview with the family, they explain their routine and, what's happening throughout the week. We also have a lot of excursions. It's an obligation for our educators to attend some of these excursions. And so families are also asked to go along to see, especially when a child doesn't cope with like a change of routine or going to different environments, families come along and get involved in that. So once they're set with a certain educator, they know all of the expectations in that home.
That's an interesting approach to the, having the compulsory excursions where, it's sort of perhaps promoting something that's, or breaking down the issues that you might have in terms of fostering some of those connections. I forgot to ask, I noted it down. I was going to ask something that you touched on there, Rachael. Stephanie, in terms of your experience as an educator in settling children in that, might have, it's normal to have those sort of attachment issues, and that takes time and things like that. But do you think there's sort of further on from what Rachael was saying, are there particular things about your environment or family daycare in general that you think are, sort of support that to occur that may not so naturally occur in other sort of early childhood environments?
Absolutely. That every time the child comes, it's the same person. So they're only building an attachment to one person. And it's interesting that even young children, like as young as, 8, 9 months old, will know that it's that person. And I've got one child at the moment. She got picked up by her grandmother today, and she wasn't happy. she didn't want to go. She kept putting her arms out for me. She's like, "This is not right. This is not the normal person that comes to pick me up here. It's normally mum or dad." So even at a really young age, they totally know what's going on, and they get used to the routine. I think too, also not having so many children in the space when a new child is entering, it's not as overwhelming, and it's more familiar in that it is a home space. It's not a super brightly coloured, lots of things all over the walls. Everyone's space is different, but it looks more like a playroom at their house, potentially.
Yeah, I think two of the things that you're speaking to there around are really about those structural elements of quality that are inherent in the model, rather than necessarily process elements of quality about what it is that we do as educators. Having one educator, one ongoing point of contact to sort of form that attachment with not too many children, so smaller group sized. In that sort of natural home-based setting is a really, they're some of the fundamental aspects that are great for family daycare that support this type of, those attachments potentially to form quicker or be more natural. So Donna, from your perspective or from a coordinator perspective more broadly, do you have any advice for educators on how to build relationships with new children or children that might be struggling to ease into the environment?
Yeah, definitely communicate with families, because you can find out their interests. Then make sure that you've got those in your program when the child arrives. Might be a special toy, it might be a special experience that they enjoy doing. That often helps a lot. Just little visits as well, if they're really struggling, just little visits. Mum can stay, and then you stay for half an hour, and then you leave, then you come back and do a bit longer, and then the family leaves. We find that works really, really well. But it hasn't been very often, but there has been a couple of times where the child just was not ready at all to be in a daycare environment, and that's okay as well. We had educators just put it on pause for 6 months, bring the child back, and it worked brilliantly. The child was then ready to be in a care environment. So I think I stress to my educators that it's not a reflection on you. It's also sometimes the child just isn't ready.
Yeah, and in those sort of circumstances where the child is not ready, obviously the best course of action is to, like you said, give it some time and wait till the child's ready. Are there particular signs or things that you would be looking out for to maybe differentiate between that and a child that might just be taking a bit of time, as we said, to ease into the setting? Are there any clear indicators that you'd be looking out for?
Definitely, if all the strategies that Stephanie and Rachel have said are at work, then that's a clear indication that they're not quite ready. Like for one child, for example, was just crying the whole time and wouldn't cry if the educator was holding the child, but would cry if anyone came near the educator and the child. So it made it extremely difficult. Within family daycare, you are on your own. You can't just, call for help. So what I suggest is asking a coordinator to come in and observe the behaviour as well, and maybe they might have some suggestions. And then, if all else fails, then try to, tease it out a bit longer. I know some families can't, which makes it a bit difficult. But if you can, just try and stretch it out a little bit longer.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess speaking to something we'll probably touch on a little bit later. Asking the coordinator, leveraging other expertise within the service type, and using the relationships that you have established within the service to seek that sort of support, and even to validate your own expertise or opinion about particular things. I think it's a good point, and probably goes to some of the the things we'll be discussing a little bit further on. Probably it's a good segue, I guess, to moving into our next section. Even though we've already touched on this, I think when we're talking about building, fostering relationships with children, one of the first things that everyone started talking about is really starting with the families and having the strong connection and options for families to spend more time in the environment, or to come in, like you said, in those little visits, or whatever it is, whatever strategy that you're using. But it really comes down to building a foundational relationship with families is going to be really important to building those relationships with children. So probably what I wanted to sort of focus on a bit tonight is, falling within that quality area 6 space, and talking about building professional relationships with educators and families. I think there's so many aspects of relationships with families that we could cover, and we've obviously sort of gone there already. Talking about collaboration, communication techniques, or having difficult conversations and things like that. We know that for some educators, obviously not all educators, that keeping that relationship professional has a number of distinct sort of challenges for some educators. And many might struggle, perhaps more so in the early days of doing family daycare, in that process of finding their feet, in defining where the boundary is in terms of a professional relationship. So Donna, did you want to give some insights into why it's important for educators to develop a professional relationship with families?
Yep, I think professional is the key there, because it can be quite easy to fall into being friends with everybody, and then it gets a little bit trickier down the line. So maintaining a professional relationship allows you to build a relationship based on trust and communication, and it opens the door to be able to work together with families around their children's needs and development, and keep that conversation purely on the child. Like, families are a wealth of knowledge, and you can get a lot of insight into the child with their background, their interests, maybe why they're not settling at a certain point, if you have that relationship. And it also helps with the child's engagement and well-being in the program. If the family is comfortable with you, then the child's going to be as well, because they're not going to see any of that anxiety leading up to drop off.
Yeah. And do you think, are there particular techniques? I mean, I've had conversations with educators and coordinators and others, around particular techniques. And one that sort of stands out for me is establishing the sort of those boundaries right from the start. Like, it's obviously going to be difficult to have the professional boundaries to some extent when educators have that close a relationship with parents, children, and, in terms of their ongoing relationship with parents that may not be necessarily occurring with staff that are on the floor in a larger centre, for example. Are there particular tips that you'd have in terms of how to make sure that you're starting off from that position?
I would say, like you said, right from the very start, establish that boundary. Maybe use some techniques where you're steering away from the conversation you don't want to have and lead it back to the child again. Some educators have found it really useful, especially during COVID, where you had to do the drop-offs and the pickups at the door. That meant that there was no time to have those extra conversations. But I would certainly recommend just trying to keep the conversation focused on the child. And if they try to steer off of that, just bring them back in again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, Stephanie, just from an educator's perspective, from your particular perspective, how do you establish professional relationships with families? And are there particular areas or techniques that you use in terms of where and how you draw that professional line?
Sure. And I think I'd firstly like to say you need to think about that professional relationship even before you've met the family, because most of the referrals will be coming from word of mouth, or so you will already have been a perception. Somebody will have already said, this person is like this, and I believe them to be this. So you will already be referred on before you've even met them. So consider when being professional, it is at all moments when you're at work. So it's at the playground when you're out with the children. Other people will see you and they will make a call there. Like if you're not speaking to your children nicely, or if something happens and a child goes missing or something, all of that is you're being judged on all of that. Other people will see it. So that professional standard has to happen from the moment you get out of bed and put your clothes on. What are you going to wear to work? What is your benchmark for being professional? So how do you hold yourself on the day-to-day? How do you greet families? That's all part of that professional bundle and the perception that others have of us and where we stand professionally. Mm-hmm. As far as I totally agree with the line is a line it's tricky. So it's all about, I think, reminding ourselves that we're in business and we're doing business. These families that are coming into our house are our clients and we are doing business with them. So when you're having conversations with them, as Donna said, keep it to children-based stuff and how was your weekend and the weather and whatever. Never, ever talk about another person's child or another family in your care with another family. Don't ever go down that line because it's a slippery slope. It's not worth it. Siblings, again, be specific about the child that you're talking about, not another child that's left. So it's the child that's in care is the most important child at the moment. And I think too, the other thing for me is to make sure your service information booklet or that long-winded thing that you hand out when you first meet families has everything in it and it's crystal clear. So if you supply sunscreen, it's in there. Look, if you don't, this is the expectation around it. If your child is sick, this is everything, how your invoicing terms, everything is in there. So you can just always refer back to it. On page 4, this is what this is what it says about late payments or whatever. And I think the most common ones that are the crossing the line are late pickups, non-payment, and sick children. They're probably the most common ones that come up. Don't ever let it slide. If you let it slide and get taken advantage of, it's really hard to then do the work to whenever something comes up, address it straight away.
Yeah, that's like you said, they're some of those sort of those key touch points. Late pickups, non-payment, sick children, they're the things that are going to 3 of the things that have the potential to occur most frequently that may allow for that slippage between your an educator's desire to support the family in whatever issues they might be having, and that professional boundary where you need to adhere to what it is that you have set for yourself as a professional in your service. Like you said, where educators are in business, you're running a business, and it's important to obviously, like you said, in that upfront written information pack or whatever it is that you give to parents, it's important to be very clear about the parameters of the service offering that you're providing and what that includes, and perhaps even where particular lines are, like in relation to some of those pain points like sick children and non-payment, things like that. And often you may be able to refer back to the services, policies and procedures as a whole as to how to deal with things. But often, you have educators have the autonomy within their own business to set some of those parameters for their own business themselves. So like you said, it's important to be clear about those things and don't allow yourself to let those things slip, because once you do, then it becomes very difficult to sort of pull it back. So it's a really some really key points that there. So Rachael, did you have some thoughts about advice that you might give to educators in your service to help them establish those professional relationships?
Yes, so our educators are encouraged to have open communication with their families and providing regular updates on a child's progress, sharing of information about daily activities, and just making the families feel welcomed into their service. Our families are highly encouraged to participate in the program that the educators have and to provide feedback. So our educators will send out the program via email, or some of them use an online platform, and then families are able to reply to the educator through those digital platforms. Also, our families are involved in events throughout the year. So we host special celebrations at Kentish, and families are invited. So us as a coordination unit also get to know the families and the children very well. We can step into any service and the families know us. They know me by name and the children as well. So I think that's really important, because then we can role model good practices in front of the educators. The educators are also trained to be culturally sensitive. Here in the Northern Territory, it's very multicultural, and we have a very diverse group of children enrolled within our organisation. So I think it's really important to also, understand differences and adapt the communication style to those differences. Part of the educator's training, so when an educator registers with us, they have to do a week of induction training, and we really unpack Quality Area 6 of the National Quality Standards with the educators. So they do understand what a professional relationship should look like. And we also encourage our educators to realise that these parents are putting trust in them to provide that child with professional love. So, seeing that child like it's their own and making sure that, their needs have been met and that the child's in a good mental state so they can learn and grow, meeting their milestones.
Did you just use the phrase professional love? Is that what you... Oh, it's a really great phrase. I've never heard that being used before, and apologies if it's something that I should be aware of. But I think it's it is a good point in the, not just in the family daycare, but in the care industry more broadly, that there's elements of relationships that are, parental relationships that are based on the love and care for your child that span across to what occurs in the care industry, but they need to occur in a professional way within very strict boundaries and regulatory frameworks and things like that. But I think it's a good phrase, and I think it's an interesting way to think about it, and particularly in relation to care for children, and children need those strong attachments, but obviously within those clear professional boundaries that span both across relationships with families and relationships with children and relationships with other staff within the service and things like that. Sorry, I did have some other notes there, but that one I just thought that was a good phrase to sort of have a little think about. We had a question submitted by Jennifer, who's an educator from Queensland, and the question is, what strategies can I employ to set and maintain boundaries with families who tend to be overly involved or intrusive? That's obviously tough one. It's not, I guess it's not very specific about what intrusive means, but perhaps, things like potentially criticising the way things are done, with the way educators do certain things. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? How we can set and maintain boundaries for parents that want to have potentially too much input into areas that are not necessarily within their control? When an educator is running their own business, they have to adhere to certain policies and procedures. Any thoughts on that?
I'm happy to take this one if you like.
Thanks, Rachel.
So I think the educator really should know their policies and procedures, like you mentioned, and having parents involved in the policy review. So, if an educator's feeling like a parent's hanging around their environment or telling the educator things that they need to do, then the educator can send out a blanket email to all families and just say, we're reviewing this policy, or I'd like to bring this policy to your attention. But also with the open communication, I think sometimes you need to be honest if you've earned that family's trust, and just tell them that, you're working within the guidelines, the framework, and the curriculum. But have those families come for special events as well, because, families are the child's first influential teacher. So, you don't want to stop families being involved, but you also want to be able to run your service without, having families breathing down your neck, telling you how you should be running your business, when we are qualified people at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's... sorry, jump in.
Oh, I was going to say, I'm not quite sure of what the context of the question is, but I'm kind of envisaging that the parent might be in the environment and taking up a lot of time. I think in my service, I'm very clear. We can do quick communication at pick up and drop off, but I've still got other kids in care. So I can't spend half an hour with you here now every morning talking, because I'm not actually with the children if I'm focused on you. So I've said to parents in the past, like, I can ring you after work or before work, or sometimes if you manage to get all your children asleep, I could do it in the afternoon. There's a time that you'll be able to fit that in, and sometimes that just clears it up. So it's like, if you've got something to discuss, I'm happy to discuss it with you. Again, bring it back to, I'm discussing stuff about your child, not my service. So if you've got issues with my service, you can contact my coordinator, or we can have a conversation about it. But I'm not going to discuss other children in care with you, because that's a breach of privacy.
Yeah, that's a good point. Being clear around the times in which you can have those types of conversations. And you also notice, Stephanie, that sort of the differences between what may be the right strategy to, depending on what the issue itself is. If you said, as an example, if they have a particular issue with the way in which you do something, but that's clearly within the parameters of how you run your service and you're clear about that, then perhaps they should take that up with the coordination unit rather than you yourself. But it's difficult, I guess, to be respond adequately to the question when it's a bit unclear as to what it is that they're exactly speaking about. I've heard, I guess, issues around, parents that want to have their child have particular things that are clearly not in line with what would be policies for safe sleep, for example, things like the amber beads around the neck and, things like that. But yeah, it's if you're finding that balancing act between what you were saying before, Rachel, around the different ways in which you might choose to communicate depending on what the issue might be. You said it's important to have open and transparent communication. However, sometimes it might be better to just push out an email to all parents just to nudge it along, so you don't have to necessarily, upset the apple cart just to resolve what might be a relatively minor issue. So, really good points there.
Can I just add one last little point in? When we've
Sure.
talked about professionalism, I think we haven't covered off confidence. So if you're responding to a parent in a non-confident way where they seem to be more confident than you are, it's going to be very hard to get them to do or for you to be where you need to be with them. You've got to come across as being on par with them, or even like, I know what I'm doing here. I'm the boss at this organisation, and you're a customer coming here. Like I'm in charge. I know what I'm doing. I'm confident that I have all these things under control. So I think confidence with that professionalism, confidence in the way we speak and the way we email and communicate and text message or whatever, that will all be seen by the parents and families. So if you're struggling, sometimes we need to do some work ourselves to get ourselves to lift the bar a little bit, just so we're in the right space to be able to say what we need to say.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks for bringing us back there, Stephanie, because you're right. I think we probably didn't necessarily speak enough about what it is to be professional. You mentioned earlier, when you're going out to look a certain way, because it is actually important that the external perceptions of people within the community of you and the service that you're running, and family daycare more broadly, that image is important. And you just said then, confidence is important, and trusting yourself, I guess, as a professional, as a qualified early childhood educator, trusting within yourself and your skills that you are and do have the expertise in relation to running your own business, adhering to these, strict standards of the National Quality Standard and the, knowing the regulations and the national law, and, having confidence in your abilities is really important, because, without that, you can't really, sort of get parents to have that level of respect for you as a professional. So I think it was a really good point that you sort of brought us back to there. And I think that's, again, it's probably a neat little segue into our third topic for the evening, because we started talking about community perception and being, having that sort of external perception of family daycares as professionals. So I should just remind you, just before we move into the final topic, if anyone in our audience, if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, I am conscious of time. We do have limited time, but please feel free to add it to the comments of whatever platform that you're currently watching. Our third topic for the evening is within that sort of QA6 space, and we're looking at relationships between educators and the service, the community, and other educators, which is across both QA4 and QA6. So we know, obviously, and we've sort of touched on already, that, of course, educators have relationships with children and families. There are obviously several other key relationships that exist in the family daycare landscape. And we can't cover them all here, but I think it's important that we sort of touch on some of the most important ones. Rachel, it's clearly important to have a positive relationship between the the educator and the approved service. But from your perspective, why do you think that's so important?
So we put the educator at the forefront to what we do. Here at Kentish, we're a very tight-knit group, and we see ourselves or refer to ourselves as the Kentish family. So it's very important for us to have positive relationships with families so they're able to provide quality care to children. If they're supported, obviously the outcomes are going to be a lot better than if they weren't supported. I did also put this question to my educators, and something that really resonated with me was an educator said, if we weren't supported, we wouldn't be doing this job. We would have left and been, in another industry or doing something different. But our educators absolutely love what they do, and they really do have the best support from the coordination unit. So our coordinators will go out and visit educators fortnightly, check in, see how they're going. We will offer assistance in the service. We'll even step in and do group time, or Quality Area 2 will assist with hand washing, meal times, making sure that we're following policies and procedures when we are working in services. We also support educators by celebrating like Book Week. Myself and coordinators, we get all dressed up and we go into the services and read books with the children, and they love that when we're coming in as characters. Our educators said that they're also able to continue on with their studies. So we've got a vast range of skill sets amongst educators. So some of our educators are currently upskilling. They've had a Cert 3 and now they're doing a diploma. And they said if it wasn't for us, they probably wouldn't sort of explore that option. Within our scheme, we have monthly support meetings for our educators. They happen in the evening after work. So we all get together and we discuss like compliance and things that we might be reviewing, policies and procedures. We also get educator input into our quality improvement plan. We give them surveys that they complete at support meetings. And then once a month, we also offer professional development to them as well. We think it's very important to be upskilling. And during those times where the educators aren't working with the children, I think that strengthens our relationship as well, because they can focus on, the training that we're providing, and it's a time that they can all come together. We also have monthly playgroup sessions. So each educator will host that. We put out a calendar for the year. So that allows educators to see what's happening in each of the services. And we also attend those sessions, myself and the coordinators. And they'll have a special event usually each month. So one educator had the ambulance come in, another educators had the library. So we also reach out to the local community and have them come in to our services as well. So that way we've got community engagement. And a positive relationship between the educators and the service directly impacts the well-being of children in their care. So we want to make sure some of them, they'll call us if they're having a bad day, and we will go out and visit them so they can get through, because we know that, children pick up on our feelings, and we want to make sure that, the children are being cared for appropriately.
Thanks so much, Rachel. You gave me so much to sort of think about there. Was just one of the points I noted down. I mean, it's clear, it's really evident that, you're talking about fortnightly visits, monthly support meeting, and other ways in which you sort of actively support educators and foster those relationships. Obviously services do things differently, and this wouldn't necessarily occur in the same way or at the same frequency in between different services. But I guess, do you find that in Kentish, in your service, that it seems like a really high level of organisational support offered to educators. Do you find that within the cohort of educators that you have registered, that there's like a spectrum of need or desire for that level of support? Because I know that some educators may want more engagement, some may want less, some may want this type of engagement, but not that. Like, do you find that there's much difference in the sort of spectrum of either need or desire for that type of level of support?
No, here in the Northern Territory is quite unique to other states. And like I mentioned before, we're very multicultural, and a lot of our educators have come from overseas. So they do rely on that support to be able to excel and, run their business effectively. And they actually love it. So a lot of our educators haven't come from the early childhood sector prior. We've got some that have got, like master degrees in other areas. So childcare is very new to them. And that's why we do offer that level of support, because we want to make sure that, our service is quality and that they're able to implement all of the national quality framework within their service. So even through like programming, we do a lot of one-on-one with the educators to be able to keep up to the standard with programs. Unless you've been to the Northern Territory, sometimes it's very hard to explain because it really is very different to other states. And even children, the weather, the climate's very different. So the children just love being outdoors all the time. And then the educators have to be able to program and support that.
Yeah, that's it's a really good point. There's, I guess it speaks to that sort of spectrum of different need, but it's interesting that you're talking about this huge diversity of educators from culturally and linguistically diverse background in, an area of Australia that is very different from other areas in Australia, and yet that's actually led to or resulted in a more uniform need for a sort of level of support from the service. So that's really interesting. It's a good point. And I think that's more broadly, I think the point is that there's going to be varying and different levels of need, both within localized communities, across specific communities, and it's just going to vary, I guess, in different areas. There's some educators that come with a vast sort of background in the early childhood space in different parts of the sector, and there's others that don't come from EC at all, but they might have a master's in biochemistry or something like that. And so it's a really good point, and I think we should probably be aware that the need is variable and the level of support is probably variable, but the necessity to foster and understand those relationships and put those, I guess, putting those from a service perspective, putting those mechanisms in place that allow for the opportunity, those structural mechanisms like the fortnightly visits or the monthly meetings or whatever it might be that suits the service or that the cohort of educators, that it's important to make sure that they're in place. Donna, just in relation to communities, do you have any insights into how educators can build relationships in their local community? Obviously, we know that family daycare does this well. Educators have the flexibility to potentially, in certain circumstances, engage more flexibly or frequently within the community. Just from your perspective, what does this look like, and why do you think it's important?
So some of our educators just don't feel comfortable doing excursions. So they might have an incursion instead. They might, invite the police in, invite the firemen in. We do a lot of group projects too. So just recently, we made cards for the firefighters that were fighting the fires near Victoria, and we sent them off, which was a huge hit. So the children were able to engage in the community, but not necessarily leave the family daycare service. Mm-hmm. We've got others that go to the supermarket, they go to other play groups. There's a great multicultural play group that one of our educators attends. There's one that goes to the community garden as well and participates there, weeding and watching the plants grow and things like that. So there's lots of things you can do. We tap into the local community, like shopping centres and the supermarkets often run little things for the school age children where they can do artwork and they'll display it for them. So we've tapped into that and they're more than happy for us to get involved in that as well. So it's just reaching out to those groups and saying, hey, we're from Family Daycare, can we join in too? And they're usually more than happy. So then when children go shopping with their parents, they get to see their artwork up displayed and they have a real sense of identity. It's really important to get community involvement. It helps with social development. There are some educators that will just go to a cafe and the children can learn how to sit at a table and how to order and all of those sort of things and have socialisation with the waiter and just learn all those skills. It also gives them a sense of belonging because they're learning about their community and it helps them understand where they are in the world and what's happening in their town. It also gives educators a support system as well. If they reach out to, inclusion support and all of those, then they have some support systems in place in the community to help them as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's really good points there. It's to me, I guess it stands out that, it requires potentially, from a service perspective, support educators to actively reach out and see what's available within their local community, because obviously that's going to be quite diverse depending on whether you're in a small regional country town or when you're outer suburbs of a metro city or something like that. It's going to be quite variable. But you're right. There's a reason why there's such an emphasis within the NQS around engagement with community, because it does do things like you said. It helps with socialization. It helps to understand the world around us, the world in which we operate, and the rules and regulations that we need to adhere to just to exist within certain communities and foster that sense of belonging, like you said. I think that something that sort of stood out to me a little bit that I want to ask you, Stephanie, about is that you're in Port Lincoln, which is quite it's quite a regional area. Do you think that there are particular things that for someone living in, like yourself, an educator operating those types of areas, whereby potentially the service isn't as immediately close by as 20 minutes down the road or something like that? Do you have any thoughts on what does it mean to you, I guess, to be in that circumstance to an extent, and is it important, or are there ways in which we need to think about those relationships? Because obviously we're saying that relationships between an approved service and an educator are important, but there are varying contexts in which those relationships take place. So do you have any thoughts around that?
I think one of the good things that came out of COVID is that we have broken down the walls of that you need to be close by to be able to connect.
Yep.
So in terms of, it's totally access to your service or to educators or community is there and easy to access for anyone if they're wanting to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I think in terms of educators networking with other educators, being that there's only a few educators in my area, to find your right tribe, like the people that are more like you. So I'm a very sustainably minded service. We built our house and designed our whole play setup so that it's sustainable. There's gardens, there's chickens, it's north facing, so we don't have to use heating and cooling. We went all out. So it's like there are other services, not so much locally here, that do similar things to me, but there are other services within Australia, and it's been easy to find them. It's kind of the way I've actually it's been surprising how I've actually met some people. So it's through professional development. Often I will meet people from other states or even overseas. I've met people from overseas. But you can, and you just get chatting, like, oh, I do this, or I grow this, or like, because I'm into gardening, and then you kind of, you spark up a conversation over interest. Some of the other really surprising places I've found network connections were through online questionnaires, or when so Family Daycare Australia and also our scheme often will send out, would you like to participate in this survey or this industry research? So a couple of those have been like they've been online sessions or phone calls with 3 other educators and the person that's collecting the research. So you get to know, like, it's an hour and a half that you're chatting with somebody, or 3 half-hour sessions or something. You get to know a bit about them, and then quite often it's like, can we contact each other afterwards? We had so many good ideas. And I think the importance about making that connection with other educators is because we work on our own, sometimes you just need to offload and go, they're driving me insane. Or can't remember, I had a really great activity to do for this theme, and now I can't remember what it is, or has anyone got any ideas? And we don't know what we don't know. So conversation with other educators is awesome. Like sometimes you'll have a child with development issues that you've not seen before, and it's like, has anyone experienced this? Or you might have twins for the first time. It's like, they're different. Like, does anyone else work with twins? Is this normal? Like, for them to talk for each other but not for themselves? Like, there's so many things, we can't know everything, but it's great to have other people that have had experiences that can help us.
Yeah, I think a really good point around, you said around finding your tribe, and it's like you said, COVID allowed for the normalization of, or the increased normalization of utilizing and leveraging technology to sort of foster and maintain those connections. And so in the world we sort of live in now, it is potentially much easier to find your tribe these days. You're not necessarily just restrained to the localized area of the network of educators that's available at a local level. You really can, and if you're actively seeking it, will find like-minded peers out there. And it's, you touched on the fact that networking and finding those peers from an educator perspective, and we all know this, that it is really important due to the structural nature of the service type. It's not easy or necessarily frequent for educators to have that daily contact with other peers to bounce ideas off of. And of course, educators have their coordinators, and they have the support that may be there from the coordination unit, but sometimes it's not necessarily that in which you're seeking. Potentially you are seeking a conversation with a peer that may be experiencing the same thing that you are experiencing, or a similar thing, or may have experience in, like you said, educating and caring for twins or something, for example. So it's a good point. And I'm sure that in the day and age in which we live, that and what we see online, we know that educators are doing that, and there's lots of avenues by which educators can network more and more these days. So I think it can only be positive for our sector that the options sort of increase in that space. And it's something that we're very conscious of here. And we want to do what we can in that space to, obviously, for members to make, the business of family daycare and the connections and what's possible as easy and, available as possible. So we're coming, I guess, I'm conscious of time, that we're sort of coming towards the end of those, the formal topics that we wanted to cover, but we did have a couple of pre-submitted questions. So if you don't mind, I might just sort of go through those and just throw that open to you guys, the experts, and see what you think. We had a question from Melina, who is an educator in New South Wales, who said, as a sole trader in family daycare, I feel undermined in the decision-making process, such as when to send sick children home or terminating care with a family. How can I assert my autonomy while still ensuring respect within my service? Does anyone have any thoughts on, what we sort of touched on earlier around that sort of professional line between asserting oneself as an educator around how they...
I think
it's
a really good idea to, when you're in that situation, just to remind yourself, I'm in business and this is a business decision. Try and take the emotional feeling thing out of it and make that as a business decision, and then follow the steps from there. So if your service booklet, your information booklet, manual, whatever you call it, that will have, or it should have, all of the information in it. So if the query was, I'm not sure about when to send home a sick child, there would have been a section in there saying, please do not send your child into care if it's got any of these things. So if you refer back to your booklet and it's one of those things, ring the family. And it's all, again, it comes back to that confidence. So if you've got a sick kid in your care and you go and go, oh, sorry to bother you, little Johnny's not feeling well, and I know it's a pain and but I think maybe he's not well and you might need to come and get him. You need to really up your own level there and lift your bar. It's like, hi, I've just taken his temperature, he's going downhill, I need him picked up in the next half an hour, whatever is reasonable in wherever you live, and just be clear, he's not well, he needs to go home. What will happen is he will go home, have some Panadol and be bouncing around, and then the parent will go, why did you send him home? But that night at midnight when he wakes up, I'm well again, she might be reminded. So remember, it's a business. We've got to run a business, and there's other kids in care that are important to make sure. We've got to make sure we're doing the right thing for all children and all families.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's, with tonight's topic is all about relationships, but sometimes, in order to maintain those relationships and keep children safe and, ensure that you have the trust of other parents, you need to, act in those ways and be confident and trust yourself and make sure you're adhering to those things that you committed to when that are written down. And I guess it also prompts me to think that, coming out of this, we've said a few times, we're referring back to that information pack that you're giving parents or something. I think that, for me, if there's educators out there listening tonight that maybe don't have necessarily as much clarity around some of those things that we're sort of touching on tonight, and where those professional boundaries might lie within some of these particular areas, I'd urge them probably to have a look at the information that you are putting out there and sort of test yourself that does it cover some of those pain points clearly. What has been your experience? And sometimes we might get into the habit of just toughing it out and just dealing with parents on an ad hoc basis around some of these issues. But I'd encourage educators that potentially aren't necessarily confident that they're covering off all of these issues and being clear about where the professional boundaries are, to go back and look at the information that you're giving to parents in that first instance, because it's clearly really important to have that line or those lines sort of drawn, really clearly. But, Stephanie, number of those key points, you're really saying you know, having that confidence and reminding yourself that you are in business. This is your business, and you're the professional within that context, and you need to sort of trust yourself and make sure that what you're putting out there reflects that. I did just have a couple of more questions, if you don't mind, before I let you go. We have one from Belinda, who's a coordinator in Victoria. Does any of the panel members, panel members run specific workshops or training that encourage their educators to share ideas and network? If yes, can you provide some information about how they can facilitate this? So, I mean, we sort of touched on it a bit earlier, Rachael or Donna. Did you have any thoughts around what ideas that, you know, what do your services do to encourage their educators to share ideas and networks? Are there particular platforms that you use? Do you actively support? I mean, we heard from Rachael earlier that obviously Kentish do, but are there particular is there particular advice that you might want to give around how they can facilitate this better or more frequently, perhaps?
Well, we use Microsoft Teams. We've created a team chat for all of our educators because some of them are a couple of hours away. So I get them to share their ideas on there. They might ask advice for other educators as well if they're having a particular tough moment. And I monitor that as well, so I can still put my opinion in as well. We do have monthly meetings, and we can run it on Teams as well. So if educators live too far away, they can still join in. We have dinners as well that are less formal, and it's a way for educators to interact with each other and talk, you know, to other family daycare educators that just understand what they're going through. We do that maybe once a term, a bit more if there's a special occasion. So we find that the Teams chat is a great one. It's used a lot, especially if I go out on a visit and I'll see something and say, oh, you should share that with the whole group. They will love it. And then everyone gets on board.
Yeah, that's, I mean, leveraging technology, we sort of touched on that already, is important. And having that sort of group chat platform that has some flexibility around how it can potentially be used. It can be used to, you know, put a chat, put a topic out there to everyone for everyone to potentially engage with, or it can be used in other more sort of targeted ways is a good way to get around that. But again, like I think it's, you know, things like having the opportunity to have those less formal dinners or whatever they might be for a service to facilitate those opportunities. Like Rachael said earlier, whether it be the monthly meeting or, you know, in what context that takes place, I assume would be quite variable. But that's, I think from a service perspective, that's really important, because clearly we know that relationships are important, and there are sort of fundamental challenges that educators in particular might have that can be alleviated by these sort of targeted strategies from services. Again, conscious of time, we do have our last question before we wrap it up, and that comes from Chamali, who's an educational leader in the ACT. Also attended the Excellence in Family Daycare Awards, unless, of course, it's a different Chamali, but I imagine it's potentially not, and was our coordinator of the year last year. Chamali says, educators' biases for gender diversity due to their beliefs, cultural and religious background, or other reasons may affect creating inclusive environments. How would you suggest those educators foster relationships with gender diverse children and families to create a more inclusive environment while considering their values and beliefs, as well as the values and beliefs of current and prospective children and families? Now, that's a big question. That's a challenging question, probably one that you know, we would perhaps encounter more frequently, you know, as these days than we may have, you know, not that long into the distant past. So I think it's important, and I think it's probably important, like as Chamali says, there's, you know, there is a significant diversity within both the communities in which family daycare operates, and we know that educators, across Australia, there is a significant diversity that is proportionally significantly greater than that which exists in that's the normal population itself. So does anyone have any thoughts around, it's a tricky question around how to deal with some of those issues or biases educators might have due to cultural beliefs, in particular in relation to things like gender diversity? I'm going to go to you, Rachel, because I can just sense that you potentially got something to say.
Yeah, so I think educators should engage in self-reflection to recognise and challenge their own biases and assumptions about gender diversity. I sort of touched on it earlier around educators being culturally sensitive as well. So creating a safe and supportive space for children and families, and environments where children feel safe and respected and valued regardless of their gender identity. I think, when children are biased, it's actually taught to them. Children are very neutral in the early years because their brain's still developing. We know that, the most rapid time for brain development is between the ages of 0 to 12. So just making sure that, children are exposed to environments that are inclusive, using language and materials that reflect diverse gender identities and expressions. So we always encourage our educators to, sprinkle culture throughout their environments. At Kentish, we have a heritage and culture team, so we do a lot of cultural experiences with our educators and children, especially around First Nations families. So the educators also do part of that as their induction training, and then we run monthly excursions that is based around the heritage and culture. Also listening to families and their perspectives for gender diverse children and families. We've had children enrolled in some of our services from same-sex parents, and we really respect that. Sometimes there's been some hard conversations had because we did have, say, one child with two mums, and the child was talking about a dad. So we had to sort of ask that parent who was a male role model in the child's life, and they said to us, I knew this question would come one day. But yeah, it's just about making families feel comfortable and respecting all religious and beliefs.
Yeah, it's a great question Charlie put forward, and it's a challenging one. I think there is, in particular for educators, again, due to the fact that they're sort of isolated, and we're talking about educators with biases that may come as a result of, religious or cultural beliefs. They're not things that you can, they're things that come with you, and they're a part of you. But the point that you made, Rachel, around engaging with critical reflection and challenging yourself and your potential biases as a result of your upbringing, where you grew up, your culture, your gender, or your own personal beliefs, I think is really important. And I think that it's when we go, critical reflection is a challenging space for family daycare, and we know that because it's clear that, we've talked about before in this forum, that it's an area in which family daycare performs the least well, is one of the elements that is not or one of the standards that's not, we don't necessarily perform highly in as a sector as a whole. So I think it's a really important point to sort of highlight, and also the point around the fact that children's biases are taught, and listening to families. I think that sort of comes full circle back to what we were speaking about at the start of the episode, that it really does, beyond your professional practice and the relation to the importance of relationships that educators have with services and services have with educators and the support structures that are in place. When we're talking about practice itself and the ultimate outcomes that we're seeking to achieve for children, an educator's engagement with families is so important. And it really was one of the sort of fundamental points that we started off with. Even when we started talking about relationships with children, we kind of started with relationships with families. So I think that's a really important point to call out there. So it's we're right on time, so I'll probably just wrap it up there. And thank you so much to all of you for joining us and giving up your valuable time this evening. It really is appreciated, and it's very important. We know that it's important for educators, service staff to have the opportunity to hear and engage with these types of discussions that are really focused on our service type specifically, and hear from yourselves that have been operating within the sector for and are doing it well for an extended period of time. So thank you so much for giving up your personal time. We know how time poor everyone within the sector is. Also thank you to the audience for joining us tonight, and for those that send in questions. It really does help us to prompt those discussions and cover off some of the issues that are important, that may be important to other educators and service staff out there. So to our audience members, don't forget that if you want to go back and view tonight's episode again, it'll be available to all FDCA members via their FDCA member zone. Of course, look forward to seeing everyone for the next FDCA online engagement series episode, which will be on play-based learning and take place on the 23rd of May. But for now, thank you all again to our wonderful panel members, and have a great night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.